But I just wanted to say, first of all, how happy I am to be here in this beautiful country. I only wish that I could stay here longer so that I could learn more about your incredible language, the Georgian language, which is, for a linguist, extremely interesting, but also for an English speaker, very difficult. I think it's safe for me to say that most, if not all of you, learned English as a second language, right, or as a foreign language. Am I right? So my subject today will be about learning a foreign language, in particular about learning English, and specifically about pronunciation. So I hope that the topic will be interesting to all of you. I mean, I think it will be relevant both to those who are learning to be English teachers, but also anybody who has tried to learn English, which I know is a very difficult language, even though it is my native language. So to begin with, I wanted to ask a question about what is a foreign accent? What is the idea of a foreign accent? Now, foreign accent is not a linguistic term, right? We have more specific ways of describing what we mean when we say a foreign accent. But what I want us to think about at the beginning is to think about what do we mean when we say someone has a foreign accent? What does that mean in terms of pronunciation? So I want us first to listen to a famous Georgian politician who is being interviewed. He speaks very quickly, so I have a hard time understanding much of what he said. But he speaks very clearly. His English is quite good. So let's, if the AV people can click on this sound, we can hear this Georgian politician. And as you listen, think about if you hear any mispronunciations and how you might explain why he pronounces things that way. So can we get this sound? Is that possible? It's like we gave it away. It's Mikhail Saakashvili.
Ukraine is 137th, as far as you know, that list. We're one of the least corrupt countries in the region. Ukraine is the most corrupt. So there are things that could be delivered very fast. You know, one of the main things I'm advising new leaders, and I've been basically meeting these days all of them, and I've been in close contact with them. I was proclaimed persona non grata by Yanukovych government. So after I came here at the beginning of revolution, I was banned from Ukraine. But I met them in Europe. I spoke with them over the phone, and I certainly extensively speak with them when I'm here. And the main advice I give them is that they should give immediate deliverables once they take power. People have expectations, people are fed up, they think that just talk is cheap, that they need deeds, they need actions, and actions could be done, you know.
Okay, how much of that did you understand? Is that okay? Actions, deeds, yeah. Did you hear any mispronunciations, you think, or a little bit? It's not clear. Yeah, there's a little bit of a buzz. I don't know how to get rid of that.
Anyway.
We'll listen to it one more time. This is what he says. I have a sound if we can play it. Well, if we play it, let me see. I don't know if we can play the sound again.
Yeah, after Rose Revolution, Georgia managed to become number 8 on World Bank list of easiest place to do business. Ukraine is 137th, as far as you know, that list. We're one of the least corrupt countries in the region. Ukraine is the most corrupt. So there are things that could be delivered very fast. You know, one of the main things I'm advising new leaders, and I've been basically meeting these days all of them, and I've been in close contact with them. I was proclaimed persona non grata by Yanukovych government. So after I came here at the beginning of revolution, I was banned from Ukraine. But I met them in Europe. I spoke with them over the phone, and I certainly extensively speak with them when I'm here. And the main advice I give them is that they should give immediate deliverables once they take power. People have expectations, people are fed up, they think that just talk is cheap, that they need deeds, they need actions, and actions could be done, you know.
Okay. Can anyone tell me any mispronunciations that you might have heard? Sorry? He omitted some words, so grammatically there's a bit of a problem. Some words, I think, like we're one of least, yeah, you can see we're one of least corrupt countries. You would say we're one of the least. But in terms of mispronunciations, does anyone see any? Hear any? Yes. That's right, yes, he did. Many of the THs, instead of saying something like 37, I heard 37, like an F. Did you? I don't know if you heard that. Anything else? Very good. Yes, very good. He makes, in English, we don't usually say beginning, beginning. We don't usually end, when we're native speakers, we don't usually end with that hard sound. But he had, you're right, at beginning of revolution, he said, right? Beginning of revolution. Anything else? Okay, so these are the words. I don't know if you can see it. The light is a little bit bright, but I've noticed, besides the vowels are very difficult for all speakers of English, so I'm ignoring the vowels. There's all kinds of, things going on there. But for the consonants, the main things that I hear are things like 37 instead of 37. You see I've bolded it here. Things, he said things, right? And then, as you pointed out, beginning, right? Beginning of revolution. Did anybody notice that he said advice? Advice instead of advice. Yes? Talk. No L. Is that?
Talk.
I'm sorry, where are we? Oh, okay, here. Talk, like too much breath. Talk. Yes, maybe. Let me see, where is that? Oh, they all talk. They just talk. It's like, yes. The other thing that I thought was, when he said deeds, usually in English we might say deeds. He said deets. Deets. Yes, they need deets. Yeah. So does anyone have any ideas about why these specific things might be hard or might cause problems for Mr. Saakashvili? Influence of L1. Oh, good. So now I can pitch this talk a little bit higher. Some of this stuff you may have heard already then. We'll see. Maybe this is all going to be things that you've already seen. Influence of L1. Good. Does everyone know what that means? Influence of L1. Yes, your native language, right? Yeah? Okay, anything else, anybody? Okay. Let me see. So I'm actually not going to get to that yet. I'm just saying I'm going to start very basic, right? What mispronunciations are, right? What a foreign accent is an incomplete learning of a language's sound structure, right? And I would say phonology, if you know that term, phonology, but we say the language's sound structure. This includes at least three things, right? Problems with perception, right? Problems with being able to hear the sounds of the language that you're trying to speak. Problems with production, right? Difficulties in getting the sounds out. Even though you know what the right thing to say is, it's hard to say it. And then there may also be problems just understanding how the sounds of a language go together, so I'll give you examples of each of these. Okay, here we have this. I'm going to be talking about problems with perception, so problems with hearing the difference between sounds. So here, have you seen these before, spectrograms? Have you seen okay. These, they should show up more clearly if there was more contrast. So I'll explain very briefly what these are. The main idea, though, is they give you a picture of the sound. So what we have is frequency on this axis, right, and time on this axis. And then you can see that some of the areas are darker than others, and that's intensity. So you actually have 3 dimensions. It shows you which frequencies in the sound are the loudest and which frequencies have no sound at all, right? And I have 4 sounds here. This is s, and this is sh, right? You recognize these symbols, I gather, because people are, okay. And then the third one is f, like an F, and the fourth one is f, like a TH, right? I had it, so can we click on these letters? Is that possible? For sounds, all of these have sounds. Each of the letters has a sound. Yeah. Okay. I don't know if we could hear. Okay, it might be difficult. Okay, so this is the sound, okay, and this is the sh sound. So if you can, oh yeah.
We can hear it.
Yeah, you can hear it now, right? And if you look at the difference, the sound has a much more intensity in the higher range. It has a hissing sound, right? And the sh sound is clearly a much lower range sound, right? So when you hear it, it sounds very different. And you can see that in the pictures, I hope, right? If you have the f sound and the th sound, even as I'm saying them, they maybe sound very similar. And English speakers themselves if you put them in a lab and try to get them to distinguish them, they also will have trouble hearing them. And you can see why in the picture, because there's very little difference that you can even see in the picture of how they're different. The difference is right around here. It's a bit lighter here, right? And a bit darker up here. In this case, it's sort of light all around, but this is kind of about almost all the same throughout here, whereas it's a bit more of a difference in the sound, right? So as you can see, these sounds, like categorically, right, are just difficult to distinguish for any speaker of any language, right? Even the language native English speakers have a problem with distinguishing these. So it's no surprise, in fact, that Mr. Saakashvili confuses exactly these two sounds, right? And actually, there are many dialects of English in which the F sound replaces the TH sound when English speakers speak as well. So sometimes learners of a foreign language, right, may have problems because they cannot distinguish sounds like this, right? Another place where that happens a lot is in vowels. Vowels in English are often very difficult to distinguish. Sometimes there are also problems with production, right? Even though you know what the right sound is, it's hard to say it.
Wabbits.
Cut. Rabbits.
Wabbits.
Rabbits.
Wabbits.
Rabbits with an R.
Oh, this duet is starting to rub me the wrong way.
Okay, it's hard to hear. But the character famously says, wabbits, right? I'm hunting wabbits. Be very, very quiet. I'm hunting wabbits, right? Instead of an R, like an American R, he pronounces a W. I mean, if you've ever seen these cartoons in English, that's how he pronounces R throughout. He even does that with L. And this is also a very common problem among English speakers, even among English speakers, as well as foreign language speakers. And there's reasons for that. It's not just, he randomly chose W as the replacement for R. Okay. There's actually reasons. If we can go to the next slide. I'm controlling it. The articulation of R in American English is actually quite complicated. All right. I don't know if we can. This one doesn't really have we need a sound, but if we could click on this picture.
Ara, ara, iri.
Yeah. So when she pronounces the R, you can see the tongue doing all kinds of crazy things. Also, her lips will move a little bit. And in this version, she's British, so she may not be pronouncing it exactly as an American would, but an American would also constrict your throat a little bit. So there's multiple things that you have to do. You have to bring your tongue up to the hard palate, the top of your mouth. You have to round your lips. In American English, we say right? You sort of do the kissing motion before you say the R. You also do a little bit in your throat, and you have to vibrate your vocal cords, all of them at the same time. And then when you move out of the R, you have to unround your lips first, then you move your tongue away to make your vowel sound. And all of these have to be timed perfectly. So basically, Elmer Fudd is simplifying things by not doing this, right? He's just rounding his lips. Instead of saying ruh, he just says wah, and he doesn't get his tongue up there. It just makes things easier. It's a very difficult sound to produce for children. I mean, it's an error that many children in America make, right, when they're growing up. And it's also very difficult for foreign language learners to produce as well. So those are problems with production. And then there are problems with just understanding how sounds go together. So it sounds like many of you may have seen this kind of thing before, right? Different pronunciations of American T, right? So the sound of American T depends on the sounds surrounding it, or where it is in a syllable or in a word, right? So understanding how all the sounds go together is very difficult for speakers of a foreign language. In this case, in the word tall, as someone was talking about aspiration, right? In the word tall, the T is aspirated at the beginning of a word with a little H sound, right? Tall. But if an S comes before it, the H sound is not there, even though it's a T. So we don't say stall, right? We say stall, just with the normal T. If it's between vowels, you flap the T, so it becomes sort of like an R or a D sound almost. You say attic, like da-da-da, like that. At the end of a syllable, you would say Atlantic, or that's how I pronounce it, Atlantic. You don't release the T. You don't say Atlantic. You say Atlantic. And you can see I also flap the T, if you notice. I also flap the T there too. Not everybody does. Some people say Atlantic, but. And then another pronunciation of T is completely different. Before an N or like an L in some dialects, the T will become a glottal stop, which is, it's hard to explain, but if you say it, if I say it, you'll recognize it. This would be button, button, like that, just the sound. Button. We don't, many foreign language speakers of English will say something like button, button, but that does not sound quite like American English, because in American English we reduce that to a glottal stop. So a misunderstanding, right, or not quite knowing how all of this gets put together is another source of a foreign accent, right? And all of this falls into the general category of phonology. So my point is that pronunciation errors, right, are not random. Usually they're systematic, okay, right? They're systematic in the kinds of errors that people make. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're random in how often a person makes them, because people are, like making them more often if they're early learners of a language, right? And they make them less when they're a little bit better at the language. But the errors themselves that people make, right, are not just random errors. You don't replace a P with an L or something, right? That doesn't make sense. But what we want to talk about, or what I want to talk about today, and what I hope you also will be talking to me about today, is the specific pattern of errors. What kind of errors do people make when they're learning a specific language, right? And as we already noted, right, one of the main sources of errors is influence from a learner's first or native language, which we call L1. Everyone knows. But another source is actually universal linguistic principles. And this is kind of theoretical, but I think there is good evidence for that as well. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just the subject of phonology, which is the subject of this talk, right? Specifically about accents, but more broadly speaking about phonology. Generally, phonology is the knowledge that every speaker of a language has about the sound pattern of their language, right? The abstract sound pattern. And again, it includes, this is not everything that's in phonology, but it includes at least these things, right? You have to know what sounds are in your language. That's the inventory of the sounds, right? You have to know that English has the th sound, right? But it doesn't have ejectives as Georgian has, like the. We don't have this the sound that Georgian has. We have a th. But then we also have to know how the sounds go together, right? Like I was talking about, the different ways of pronouncing T. There are certain restrictions that each language has, right, on how sounds can be put together, and that's phonotactics. And then there are also rules about how and when sounds change, in what environment sounds change. And so we'll get to all three of these as well. I'll go quickly through them. So an example of phoneme inventory, right, a very difficult one for learners of English is the inventory of vowels. And so in American English, I would say there's about 13, including diphthongs. It depends on your pronunciation. This one, I don't actually pronounce this differently. But anyway, there's, at least there's more than 10 vowels in American English, and each of them has to be distinct. Otherwise, you would not know the difference when somebody said heed and when somebody said hid, right? If you are unable to hear or produce this difference and make all of these distinctions, then you will come up with some pretty difficult problems, right? Heed and hid are completely different words, and if people can't understand you, or if you can't, produce them properly, then problems will arise. So all of these, well, do you know all these symbols? Do you know all of these vowels? Should we say them together? Can you do them together? This one is E, right? E, I, A, which I would probably put a little diphthong there. Right? A. These are all different. This one maybe is more British. Yeah. Oi, ow, I, you, right? It's a sort of reverse diphthong. U, this one is extremely difficult for many speakers. O, and right? Any questions about any of these? American English speakers have to make all of these distinctions, right? Yes, for example, the difference between head and had. Whereas in Georgian, so I tried to look up some information about Georgian before I came, which was previously to this trip unfamiliar language to me, but in Georgian there's only 5 vowels. And actually that's the case in most of the world's languages. So I believe this is e, e, a, o, and u. Is that correct? Right. So you would have to make a distinction between these syllables. Gi, ge, ga, like gira, girao. Is that right? Geri, garia, gora, gura. Is that pretty good? Yeah. It's easier for me, I think, because I come from a language with more vowels than with fewer, right? All right. So that's the inventory. In phonotactics, we're talking about how the rules that govern when and where sounds can be put together, right? So you can't just string sounds together to form syllables or words randomly, right? There are restrictions on how that happens, and each language has their own. A very famous example when it comes to Georgian, in comparison to English, of the ways that sounds are able to be put together in Georgian as opposed to English is in the initial consonant clusters, right? Georgian is very famous among linguists for these very complicated initial consonant clusters. We'll begin with English. In English, there's very strict rules of what can occur at the beginning of a syllable in terms of consonants. You can have at most three consonants at the beginning of a word, and the first one has to be S. There's no exception. It has to be S. The second one has to either be P, T, or K, and the third one has to be a liquid, R or L, right? And so these are okay. Street, scream, split, right? And you can think of other things too, right? Like sclerosis or whatever. But these kinds of combinations are totally not okay, although they might be okay in other languages, right? In English, we don't have things like skr or tkr or smula or anything like this, right? We just cannot do it. It's very difficult for English speakers. On the other hand, Georgian
Many consonants.
allows a lot of consonants at the beginning, up to 8, I am told.
Oh my.
I am told. So this one has
That's hard.
just 4. It's not that many, right? Brtkali, is that right? Brtkali, something like that? Brtkali.
Wow.
This one I don't know, but this one always comes up. Yeah. Mtsavrtneli. And this is the longest one that I was able to find. Does this make sense? Is this an actual word?
Yeah.
It is? Okay.
Impossible.
Can somebody say this word?
Kaprutkuni.
Vprtkvni.
Kaprutkuni.
Right, so
Hardest
an
language.
interesting thing about this is that even though you hear it as one syllable, whatever, when I hear others say it, it sounds to me like 3. And that's because my language does not allow this many consonants at the front, right? It sounds to me like 3. It sounds to me like gv, something like that. And ni, something like that. I can't do it. So, and then the last thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of phonology is phonological alternations. Some languages don't really do this. A lot of languages of Europe have a lot of very complicated alternations. But what I mean is that in certain specific environments, regular sound change occurs. Okay, and we call this also allophonic variation, if you are familiar with that term. And often these changes occur or can be analyzed as a repair to phonotactic restrictions. I'll show you what I mean. All right? Let me just catch up here so I know what's coming up. This is a little bit different than how I usually give presentations. Usually I can control both at the same time. So excuse me if I'm going back and forth. So in English, we have a constraint that says at the end of a syllable, or particularly at the end of a word, if you have 2 consonants, okay, 2 obstruents in fact, you have to have the same voicing on both. Now, does everybody know what voiced and voiceless means? Kind of, yeah, okay, so this is very familiar to you then. I can see everybody, I've seen this before. But consonants at the end of a word must basically come from the same group. So I've grouped them here for you. Voiced consonants have vocal cords going at the same time, right? They kind of, you hear a little bit of singing when you say them, like b, d, g, v, z, the buzzing, you know, v, zh, and j, right? But voiceless obstruents are kind of the whispery ones, right? Like p, t, k, right? There's all that stuff. Sounds like a Georgian word, but no. Just,
Sounds like.
I was just kidding. So when you have these occurring together at the end of a word in English, both of them have to come from the same group, right? And this happens regularly in English when, for instance, we add the plural morpheme to a word. So if you have a word that ends with a voiceless consonant, obstruent, like cat, right, or ship, or rock, then the plural morpheme comes up as an S, because it's also whispery, like cats, right, ships and rocks. But if it ends with a voiced consonant, like rod, or cab, or dog, right, you'll get a Z at the end. Rods, cabs, and dogs. Right? And English speakers know these very automatically and naturally, native English speakers, I mean, but speakers from other languages have to learn them separately. You have to learn them laboriously in class. What we would say about the plural morpheme is that really there's only one morpheme. There's not two different ways to make a plural. There's not an S and a Z. There's one. I would say theoretically it's a Z, but you can choose whichever one you want. And it has two forms. It's the same morpheme, but shows up in two ways. And those two forms we call allophones, right? And this restriction on voicing influences not only the plural morpheme, right, but also all kinds of other things in the language, right? So not only the plural morpheme, but also the S of the third singular present, right? If you say hits versus bids, there's a difference there. And also you see the simple past. When you say stopped, like I stopped it, versus robbed, you'll see again the voicing restriction occurs, right? So just to recap what phonology is about, right? We've talked about the inventory. These are the kinds of things that a language learner has to learn, right? They have to know the inventory, what sounds there are in the language. They have to know the phonotactics, how to put those sounds together, right? And then they have to know the phonological rules or the alternations, how the sounds in the language change and when, right? Usually these are due to phonotactic constraint violations. So if we go back to what I said about foreign accents, right? The specific pattern of errors that a language learner makes, right, will come from influence from L1 and also from some universal linguistic principles. And this has to do with universal grammar. So let's talk specifically about second language acquisition. As I said, every language has its own phonology with its own rules, its own inventory, right? And every second language learner is building, and I say that on the next slide, but is building a version of the L2 phonology as they are learning the language, right? So as they build their version of the phonology of L2, the language that they're learning, they're getting input both from the phonology of the language that they already know and also the phonology of the language that they're learning, right? So not only do they have those two sources, but they also have, I will claim, universal phonological principles that are causing problems sometimes as they learn, okay? So first we'll talk about transfer of phonology from L1 to L2. And this is pretty much everyone's intuitive understanding of what causes an accent, right? What causes mispronunciations is the fact that you're bringing things from the language that you already know and mispronouncing them, other words from a foreign language as if they were part of your language. We'll see that speakers of different L1s, right, have different ways of pronouncing English th. And it's kind of regular. It depends on the language that you're speaking. This is how linguists know. We don't just claim things based on what people kind of intuit, but we want some evidence, right, that things are this way. And linguists will say, oh yes, clearly there's transfer of L1 phonology to L2 because different languages regularly pronounce certain sounds in different ways. So Japanese speakers will generally pronounce the English th sound as an S, right? So they say sing instead of thing, whereas Thai speakers, for instance, will usually pronounce the th sound like a T. So they'll say ting, thing, instead of thing, right? And German speakers are usually like this, and Russian speakers are usually like this. So you can kind of see that it depends on the language that you're coming from, right? So we know this to be true. One analysis, okay, there are many possible analyses, but one analysis of how this works is as follows. So we would say that T is a much, in a sense, easier, less marked. You know that term, right? It's much less marked than th. It's an easier sound. So this would be the default change between these two, because T out of these three is the easiest, is the least marked. So you would prefer to change it to T. T is learned earlier by children, right? And more languages have T that don't have S, right, than languages that have both. Does that make sense? Okay. So change to T would be the default, right? And some languages cannot do that change, so therefore those languages change it to S. Okay. So what I'm saying is, in the case of Japanese, right, we know that Japanese has these following changes. Before E, a T becomes a ch. And before U, a T becomes a ts. So they're making a move toward S or sh. Right? They're making a move towards making a stop, a fricative, but they don't go all the way. Right? They're trying to get to S, it seems, but there's something in the language that blocks them. They have a real avoidance of making that change fully. Other languages will do that. Even English, right? The T-I-O-N on the end of English words becomes a sh. The T just goes straight to sh. None of this sort of ch remaining T sound in it, right? We just go straight to sh. But Japanese wants to sort of preserve a little bit of T-ness. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So therefore, we can see that even though the default for all languages would be to change the th to a t, because that involves a change from a fricative to a stop, right? It's a change in manner. That is avoided by Japanese, which shows that it does not like those changes. Does that make sense? Right? Japanese prefers to go to S. So to keep the fricative a fricative, okay? So then it prefers to go to S. German is the same way. So we can see that the phonology of the L1 is influencing the way that speakers use the L2. Okay. However, not everything can be attributed to L1 influence to L2, right? So there are these interesting studies that have been done, all kinds of studies. I just picked two, right? Where they tested Korean and Japanese performance, Korean speakers and Japanese speakers' performance on initial English clusters, right? All such initial clusters are disallowed in those languages. There's no case of a cluster that's better or worse in those languages. They are all bad, and they never appear in those languages, right? Nevertheless, we find this pattern where Korean and Japanese speakers are better. This is according to the study. So this is according to the small group of people that they tested. They were better at pronouncing the pr cluster than they were at pronouncing the br cluster. So they were better at saying like proud than they were at saying like brew or something. And then those two were better than with fr, like from or something like that, right? And one explanation for this is that these sounds are following a markedness scale. So you said that you know what markedness is, right? So I'm just going to use it, right? Voiceless consonants are less marked than voiced, or voiceless stops are less marked than voiced stops. And all stops are less marked than fricatives, okay? So there's this kind of universal linguistic preference for these kinds of sounds, okay? And another study was done with Hungarian speakers and speakers of other languages too. So in many languages, it's the case that consonants at the end of a word will always become voiceless, even if they started out as voiced. So in German, there's this case, right? German is always the famous case where there's a word rad with a D, rad. So you would say like rad or red with a D. But once it happens at the end of a word, you say rat with a T. And it becomes indistinguishable from R-A-T. Rat and rat sound the same, right? So German speakers, it would make sense that they might import that rule into English, right? And they might say bet for bad, right? Like I had a bet day or something like that. I don't know. This study doesn't talk about Germans. But Hungarian speakers also did this, okay? The Hungarian speakers have a distinction in their language at the end of a word between, say, D and T and B and P. Yet, when they were learning English, they still did that, okay? They still devoiced the last letter of the words. That's kind of puzzling, right? They're not getting it from Hungarian, but it just naturally kind of happens. And again, the explanation would be, as I said, universally, we think, in languages, voiceless stops are less marked, or maybe we might say easier, than voiced stops, right? So especially at the end of a word, this is kind of a natural pattern to turn this D into a T. Speakers just want to do that. So when they're learning a new language that's not their own, sometimes they haven't gotten the phonology right. And so this kind of natural push from your natural linguistic knowledge sort of shows up. And you start to do these rules that belong neither in L1 nor in L2. Okay? Now, I want to talk about phonotactics in particular, okay? So phonotactics, you remember I was saying, right, is the rules that determine, most of the time we talk about phonotactics as the rules that determine the consonants that can form a syllable, right? How many consonants can go at the beginning? How many consonants can go at the end? How many consonants there can be in the middle, okay? Now, Japanese phonotactics, in Japanese, this was an experiment done with Japanese speakers. So in Japanese, you cannot have any syllable that ends with an obstruent. You have some syllables that end with maybe like an N or an M sound, but you can never have a syllable that ends with like a P or a T or anything like that, right? So if you are going to import a word from English like Christmas, here you have a syllable that has two consonants next to each other. You can't do that in Japanese, right? You have this S sound that ends the syllable, Chris, and then mus, another S. That doesn't work in Japanese either. So when Japanese speakers pronounce it, they add vowels, right? So instead of saying Christmas, you would hear something like Christmas or something like that. Actually, they usually devoice these to try to make it sound a little better, like Christmas, right? Christmas. But you see, they put vowels everywhere, right? Now, there was an experiment that was done on Japanese speakers and French speakers where they played versions of this nonsense word in both languages. So it was not a word that French speakers were familiar with, nor was it a word, obviously, that Japanese speakers were familiar with, okay? So they had a continuum of sounds where they had on one end the word pronounced ebzo with like nothing here, okay? And then on the other end, they had ebuzo, where they put a full oo, very clear, ebuzo, right? And then they had a continuum where they shortened this oo sound, okay? So you had ebuzo and ebuzo and ebzo, right? And then finally you had ebzo with nothing, right? Japanese speakers along the whole continuum, they only heard ebuzo. They reported hearing the U, no matter what, ebuzo, all the time. They heard it, okay? They actually heard it, even though it wasn't there, okay? But French speakers, you know, since this is possible in their language, at a certain point in the continuum, you know, maybe there'd be like a tiny U, they wouldn't really hear it, but they would sort of switch over, like half of this would be ebzo, and the other half would be ebuzo, right? Now, what explains that is, of course, the phonotactics of the language. Japanese does not allow this kind of a word, so the phonotactics of their language actually influences their perception of linguistic phenomena. Okay, any questions? Does that make sense? All right. Phonotactics also influences production of L2, right? So I have spent some time teaching Spanish speakers English. And one of the most famous problems with Spanish in terms of English is that Spanish does not have any clusters at the beginning of a word that begin with S and then a consonant, right? So even though other Romance languages have the exact same word, Spanish cannot start a word with this kind of a cluster. So in Italian, you could have scuola, which means school. In English, it's the same word too, right? But in Spanish, you say escuela, right? You have to put the E in front of it because they just do not do this. So in order to make it better, they form two syllables, an S syllable and then the rest of the word, escuela. Yeah? So this is why Spanish learners of English often make errors such as this. Eschool, right? I go to a school on Main Street. You hear them say this. Even when they say the name of their language, they say Spanish, right? And even though they know that they're saying the wrong thing, I can sit with somebody and say, just sit with them for like hours and just say, school, They'll say "a school," right? And I say, "No, school," and they'll say "a school," and they'll say "school," and they know they're getting very frustrated because they know they can hear that it's different. It's not a problem with perception. It's not the case of the Japanese speakers who heard it. They've been around long enough that they know that this is not here, but they just have trouble pronouncing it because of the phonotactics of their language. Okay, does that make sense? And then the last topic that I wanted to talk about was to try to bring it back to Georgian speakers, okay? So I found some examples of Georgian speakers learning English, and I wanted to listen to them, so I hope we can. But before talking about them or listening to them, I just wanted to say a couple of general things, which is most of the problems that I hear Georgian speakers having with English has to do with the vowels, which is understandable because the vowels are very difficult for anyone. And most of those are actually not that big of a problem. Like, they don't sound quite like American vowels, but it's understandable. But Georgians generally don't have a problem with consonants because Georgian has so many more consonants than English, so they usually don't have a problem. However, since the problems with vowels are so many more, right, I just am going to be paying attention to the consonants. It just makes it easier for a talk that's, a set length. So I want to especially look at phonotactic factors, not inventory reasons, right, but phonotactic reasons why Georgian speakers might be making errors in their English, consonants, okay? So this is the text that was given to Georgian speakers to read. It comes from the GMU Speech Accent Archive. So if we could listen to the first one, this is a woman.
Please call Stella. Ask her to bring these things with her from the store. 6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick slabs of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob. We also need a small plastic snake and a big toy frog for the kids. She can scoop these things into 3 red bags, and we will go meet her Wednesday at the train station.
Okay. Did anybody hear any errors in there? Consonants, I mean. Yes. 3. Ask. Yes, right. Diphthongs. Yeah, she said scoop.
Diphthongs mainly we have diphthong mistakes because we don't have a diphthong in our alphabet. That's why we have difficulties with these
Most
sounds.
of it was the vowels, I think, right? The diphthongs and the vowels are a problem. In terms of consonants, well, we'll talk about them later. But I did hear somebody mention scoop.
She said also red instead of red.
Scoop. She said
Red.
Ned. I think some of that is just it's hard to hear. So it sounded like she said. I think when I listened to it on my earphones, she did say red, but scoop.
Scoop. She's
Plastic. Yeah, that's a vowel. I mean, that's a vowel issue, right? Yeah. With an S at the end, right? Somebody think that? Oh, she said cheese?
That's right. Cheese? That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of vowel issues. I don't remember whether she said S there, but we'll talk about some specific examples that I pulled out. Let's at least listen to the second speaker. The second speaker is clearly someone who has not been studying English for as long. So this is number 2.
Please call Stella. Ask her to bring these things with her from the store. 6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick slabs of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob. We also need small plastic snake to a big toy frog for the kids.
Those are okay.
She can scoop these things into 3 red bags, and we will go meet her Wednesday at the train station.
Okay, so he goes much slower, of course, because he's early on in his learning English. He also said scoop, right? But his vowels are not so bad. But anyway, I'm not talking too much about vowels. I don't know, was there anything else that anybody wanted to point out about? Yes? Snack instead of Oh, you mean with the vowel or
Oh,
with the vowel? Yes, right. Snack. I think that was within the acceptable range. Store? You mean store?
oh, instead of Bob.
Where? For store, you mean? And store. Yes. The T is actually there, but it's quite aspirated. He said store. Yes. So that's why it sounds like he said store. Yeah. So, okay. I have two things that I wanted to pull out. One thing that didn't come up was that there was a lot of devoicing of obstruents at the end of words. So Georgian does not allow voiced obstruents at the end of words. That's what I'm told. Is that true? There's no such thing as a B or like a Z sound or a G sound at the ends of words. Is that right? Is that right? I'm going to assume that it's right. Okay. Is that right? Yes? Okay. At the end, right. At the very end of words. So if we could click on this.
Bring these things.
Okay. Can we do it one more time?
Bring these things.
Okay, you can't quite hear it, but she actually says, brink. Did you see this? She sort of says, brink these
Stop.
things. So look, here, for these, it looks like these. She's got a pretty good, actually, she might have done this Z correct, right? But here, this one is completely an S. Things instead of things, right? Now, the main problems are the ends of the words, right? Brink, she puts like a K at the end of bring here. Bring, you can see the B and the R, this is the vowel. Bring, this is the ng sound. So bring, okay? And then you have these. This looks pretty good. You know it's voiced with a Z because of this part here is dark, okay? But then here, it's a little bit lighter, and then all the way up and down, this is a true S. So she says, brink these things, okay? So these two were devoiced here. Here's an example of an English speaker. Can we hear this?
Bring these things.
It's very fast. Can we do it
Bring
again?
these things.
One more time.
Bring these things.
Okay, so you see, there's clearly no brink, right? She goes straight through, all the way. This is all voiced. Bring these
Connect.
things, right? Interestingly, she does the opposite as the Georgian speaker. Even though we say this is a Z sound, these, do you see our English speaker makes it an S? Isn't that interesting? These. So actually this happens in speech in English, especially when you have a voiceless consonant at the beginning. So things is voiceless, this Z kind of becomes an S. That might confuse speakers of other languages a little bit, right? But at the end of things, clearly she's got a very clear Z. Things, okay? So, but she definitely does not say brink. Brink, that's a pretty bad error. Bring these things, okay? Now, we have to think about, or what I want to think about, right? If we're doing linguistics, is what's the nature of this problem? Is it that the Georgian speaker is not hearing the case, that there are voiced consonants at the end of a word? Or is it just that she's having trouble pronouncing them, right? Because they're not allowed in her language. Or does she not realize that in English, because in Georgian there is a rule, even if there were in other cases a voiced consonant at the end of a word, once it becomes the very final last consonant of a word, it becomes devoiced, right? So maybe she doesn't realize that that does not happen in English, right? In order to understand this, we would need to actually get a lot of Georgian speakers into a lab and test them, right? Test them, can you distinguish between these two sounds? Okay, so it's not an issue with perception, right? Then once we know that you understand it, what exactly are you having trouble with pronouncing? Are there other cases where you're making the same mistake, right? Okay. She says store, right? Here's the S, there's the T. It sounds like nothing because when you say a T, it's just like that, right? So store, and then she closes it off. So this is the vowel in the R. Here's where the T happens, and the S has this fun stuff at the top. But you can see both Georgian speakers say S, here's the T, and then all of a sudden they have this little breath that happens right before the vowel. Here again, it's very subtle. S, this one's a little bit more clear. S, T, right? T with the H here, and an or. So this is like store. You see that? Store. So you can see it. Even if you can't hear it, you can see it in the spectrogram. Again, we would want to ask, from a linguistic point of view, what is the nature of the problem? Is it that they are not hearing the difference, or they just can't produce it? I know that in Georgian, it might be possible to have that kind of an aspirated obstruent after an S, right? But in English, it's not possible. So maybe there's a little bit of issue with their phonotactic knowledge. But of course, we would need more time and more experimentation to look at it, okay? So basically, I just wanted to give you an idea, right, of how we would look at some of these problems of foreign accent, right, or learning English pronunciation from a linguistic perspective. Of course, you can look at language learning from a lot of different perspectives, right, like your learning environment, the sociological environment, or the environment that you were raised in, right, the people that are around you, whether you get a lot of positive or negative feedback. You could look at it from a psychological perspective, right, in terms of intelligence maybe, or maybe there's like a language learning ability in the brain or something. Even biological, which would be sort of similar, right? A lot of times it's noted that biologically, humans have trouble learning languages after a certain age, whereas before a certain age, it's pretty much okay, right? You don't have any problems, so there's a biological issue. But what I've been talking about is linguistic ways of looking at this problem, right? And I think there's a lot of things to be discovered and to be addressed. As I was just saying, even just with the few Georgian examples, you could create multiple experiments, right? And do multiple papers, right? Do multiple dissertations on even just those examples and what exactly is going on, what the theory is behind it. So I hope mainly what I wanted to do was just to get you interested, if you aren't already, a little bit in linguistics, and to show you how a linguistic perspective on some of these problems might be different from some of the things you've learned before. So I hope that all of that was at least a little bit interesting and maybe a little bit relevant to your own lives. Okay, thank you.